In the quiet, foggy town of Ashbourne, life moved at an unhurried pace, but for Evelyn Hart, the passage of time was a constant reminder of a hole in her heart, one that spanned 28 long years. It was a chilly November morning when Evelyn's life took an unexpected turn. While clearing out her late father's attic, she stumbled upon a wooden box marked with the initials RH. It wasn't hers, nor her father's. Curiosity gnawed at her as she unlatched the box and uncovered a collection of old photographs, letters, and a pocket watch frozen at 10:14. One letter, dated February 12, 1995, was addressed to her mother, Amelia Hart, from a man named Richard Hawthorne. My dearest Amelia, I must leave Ashbourne for reasons I cannot yet explain. Know that you and Evelyn are my world, and one day, I will return to bridge the gap this absence will create. Please keep this watch safe, it will guide us back together. Evelyn froze. Her mother had never mentioned a man named Richard. All she knew of her father's life before her birth was that he was a traveling salesman. Yet, the letter revealed a deep love story, a mystery buried in time. Fueled by questions, Evelyn began piecing together the fragmented puzzle. She consulted old records, visited her childhood neighbors, and scoured the town library. The name Richard Hawthorne appeared sporadically in the town's history, but nothing after 1995. One evening, she stumbled upon an elderly man at the library who overheard her inquiries. Hawthorne, he asked, his voice tremulous. He was an inventor, brilliant, but secretive, disappeared one night without a trace. Some say he got involved in something dangerous. Evelyn's search led her to a decrepit cabin on the outskirts of Ashbourne. Inside, the walls were covered with sketches of strange machines, journal entries, and maps marked with peculiar symbols. The cabin felt untouched, frozen in the year 1995. At the center of the room was a large contraption, resembling a clockwork machine, with wires and gears sprawling outward. A journal on the desk explained everything. Richard had been working on a time travel device. His notes hinted at an experiment gone wrong, suggesting he'd been flung into an uncertain future, or trapped in the past. The machine still hummed faintly, as though waiting to be awakened. Evelyn hesitated but couldn't resist. She flipped the switch. The room filled with a blinding light, and when it faded, a man stood before her, his face weary but familiar. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. Richard, she asked, her heart pounding. I promised I'd return, he said, tears welling in his eyes. In the hours that followed, Richard explained his disappearance. The machine had malfunctioned, stranding him in 2032, where he had waited until technology caught up to help him return. But while only a few months had passed for him, 28 years had gone by in Evelyn's timeline. Evelyn struggled with the reality of it all. Her life had been shaped by his absence, her mother's silence, and the longing for answers. Yet here he was, the man who had loved her mother deeply and unknowingly left a legacy of heartache. As the two grappled with the years lost, Evelyn found a sense of closure. Richard had not abandoned them. He had been a victim of his own ambition. Together, they decided to preserve his story, ensuring the next generation understood the cost of tampering with time. Evelyn left the cabin that night, the pocket watch ticking once more in her hand. The gap of 28 years had been bridged, not by time, but by the enduring power of truth and love. The gap of 28 years, Part 2. Evelyn and Richard sat across from each other at the cabin's rickety wooden table. The faint hum of the time machine filled the silence, mingling with the distant rustle of wind through the trees. For Evelyn, the moment felt surreal. The man she had only known through an old letter and fragmented memories was now flesh and blood, sitting right before her. Why didn't my mother ever tell me? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. She never spoke of you. She raised me to believe my father was someone else. Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of guilt. Amelia wanted to protect you. She knew my work was dangerous. After I vanished, she must have thought I was gone for good. Evelyn clenched the pocket watch in her hand. She must have been devastated. We both were, and yet, you were out there, trying to come back. Richard nodded. Every moment I was stuck in the future, I thought of you and Amelia. I promised myself I'd fix the machine and return. But time doesn't play fair. The words hung heavy between them. Evelyn wanted to lash out, to release the anger that had built over the years, but seeing the pain in Richard's eyes, she softened. He, too, had been a victim of the machine's cruel trickery. Do you still love her? Evelyn asked suddenly, catching Richard off guard. I never stopped, he said quietly. Amelia was my world, and so were you. Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of her mother, who had passed away a decade earlier. She's gone, she whispered. Cancer. She fought as hard as she could, but it wasn't enough. Richard's face crumpled, and he lowered his head into his hands. I failed her. I failed both of you. No, Evelyn said firmly. You didn't fail. You tried to come back. You're here now. Silence fell once more, but this time it wasn't heavy with regret. It was filled with unspoken understanding, a bridge over the 28-year chasm. Revisiting the past, over the following weeks, Evelyn and Richard worked to repair the time machine. Richard was determined to perfect it, hoping to ensure no one else would suffer the same fate. Evelyn, on the other hand, found herself drawn to the idea of using the machine to revisit pivotal moments in her life. What if we could go back? Evelyn asked one evening as they soldered wires and recalibrated gears. What if we could see her again? Richard hesitated. Time travel is dangerous. Changing even the smallest detail could have catastrophic consequences. I don't want to change anything, Evelyn said. I just want to see her, to say goodbye. Richard studied his daughter's face, torn between his fear of tampering with time and his longing to see Amelia one last time. If we do this, he said finally, we have to be careful. No interactions, just observers. Evelyn nodded, her resolve firm. A glimpse through time. The day finally came when the machine was ready. Richard set the coordinates to a sunny afternoon in 1997, the year Evelyn turned 7. As the machine roared to life, the cabin filled with golden light, and the world around them melted away. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the backyard of their old house. Evelyn gasped as she saw her younger self playing with a toy plane, her laughter echoing through the yard. And there she was, Amelia, alive and radiant, hanging laundry on a clothesline. She paused, shielding her eyes from the sun, and smiled as she watched young Evelyn play. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. She looked so happy, she whispered. She was, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn wanted to run to her, to hug her mother and tell her everything, but she remembered Richard's warning. They were only observers. As they stood there, an overwhelming sense of peace washed over Evelyn. Her mother's love had always been enough, even without Richard. Amelia had given her a happy childhood, filled with warmth and laughter. I'm ready to go back, Evelyn said softly. Richard nodded, and they returned to the cabin in a flash of light. A new beginning. The journey through time brought closure for both Evelyn and Richard. For Richard, it was a chance to see the life he had left behind and to honor the love he shared with Amelia. For Evelyn, it was a reminder of her mother's strength and resilience. The two decided to dismantle the time machine, vowing to keep its secrets safe. Richard chose to stay in Ashbourne, rebuilding his life in the town he once called home. As the seasons passed, father and daughter grew closer, their bond healing the wounds of the past. The gap of 28 years was no longer a void but a bridge, a connection forged through time, loss, and love. The gap of 28 years, Part 3. Evelyn stood outside the cabin, staring at the dismantled remains of the time machine. The device had brought her answers, closure, and a father she thought she'd never meet, but with its destruction, the temptation to alter the past was finally laid to rest. Richard emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. It's done, he said, his voice steady. The machine won't work anymore. Evelyn nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. It's better this way. We've had our chance to see her. We don't need to tempt fate anymore. As they walked down the forest path back towards Ashbourne, Evelyn's thoughts churned. The visit to her childhood had brought peace, but it also left her with lingering questions about the future. Richard, she began, hesitant to call him Dad just yet, what's next for you? You've been living decades ahead. How do you plan to adjust to all this? Richard chuckled softly. The world I came back to is simpler, slower. It's not easy, but I think it's where I'm meant to be. I want to make up for lost time, with you, and with myself. Evelyn gave him a small smile. That's a good answer. Rebuilding bonds. Life in Ashbourne resumed its quiet rhythm. Evelyn introduced Richard to her friends and colleagues at the local university, where she worked as a history professor. His knowledge of advanced technology fascinated her peers, though Richard remained careful not to reveal too much about his past or future. Their relationship grew stronger with each passing day. Evelyn shared stories of her life, from her struggles as a teenager to her career ambitions. Richard, in turn, recounted tales of his experiments, his love for Amelia, and the isolation he endured in the future. One evening, as they sat on Evelyn's porch watching the sunset, Richard handed her a small leather-bound journal. "What's this?" Evelyn asked, flipping through its pages filled with sketches and notes. "It's everything I've learned," Richard said, "not just about time travel, but about life. I want you to have it. Maybe one day, it'll help you understand me better." Evelyn clutched the journal to her chest. "Thank you, for everything." A new journey. Months turned into years, and the pain of the past began to fade. Evelyn found herself opening up to new possibilities. Inspired by the reunion with her father, she started writing a book about the mysteries of time, blending historical accounts with speculative fiction. Richard, meanwhile, took on a quiet life, volunteering at the local library and mentoring young students in science. Though the world around him was unfamiliar, he found solace in the steady rhythm of Ashbourne. One crisp autumn morning, Evelyn received a letter from a renowned publishing house. Her book, titled The Gap of 28 Years, had been accepted for publication. Overjoyed, she rushed to tell Richard, who beamed with pride. "You've turned our story into something beautiful," he said. "It's not just our story," Evelyn replied. "It's a reminder that no matter how much time passes, the bonds we share can always be rebuilt." Epilogue. Years later, Evelyn stood at the edge of the Ashbourne forest, holding the pocket watch that had once belonged to Richard. He had passed peacefully in his sleep the previous winter, leaving behind a legacy of love, resilience, and discovery. The cabin, now overgrown with ivy, remained a testament to the extraordinary journey they had shared. Evelyn smiled as she turned the watch over in her hands, its ticking a comforting reminder of the time they'd reclaimed. With a deep breath, she walked away, ready to embrace the future, a future shaped not by the gaps of the past, but by the connections that had filled them.